A single heartbeat on a monitor can change the fate of an entire hospital. For charge nurse Clara Evans, saving the life of a heavily scarred, unrecognizable John Doe wasn't a choice. It was an oath. But when hospital politics collided with morality, she found herself stripped of her badge and escorted out by security, branded a liability by the very people sworn to save lives. The administrators thought the problem was solved, the silence restored. That silence shattered 3 days later when a convoy of black government SUVs screeched to a halt outside the emergency bay, and a battle-hardened Special Forces commander stepped out with one terrifying question that would bring the hospital administration to its knees. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made the neon lights of the emergency bay at Mercy General Hospital blur into streaks of blood red and cautionary yellow. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, the graveyard shift in name and spirit. Clara Evans adjusted the collar of her scrubs. They were blue, standard issue, but tonight they felt heavy. She had been on her feet for 14 hours. Her feet throbbed in her worn-out sneakers, but her eyes, sharp, hazel, and unrelenting, scanned the intake board. Clara wasn't just a nurse. At 32, she was the backbone of Mercy General's Level 1 Trauma Center. She knew the rhythm of life and death better than she knew her own heartbeat. "Coffee, Clara?" She turned to see young nurse Toby holding out a lukewarm styrofoam cup. Toby was fresh out of nursing school, still optimistic, still shaking when the codes came in. "Thanks, Toby," Clara said, taking a sip. It tasted like burnt toast, but the caffeine was necessary. "Quiet night so far. That worries me." "Maybe the city is sleeping," Toby suggested with a smile. "The city never sleeps, Toby. It just reloads." As if on cue, the red phone at the trauma desk screamed. The sound cut through the low hum of the ER like a knife. Clara slammed the coffee down, her demeanor shifting instantly from tired colleague to field general. She grabbed the receiver. "Mercy General, Evans speaking." The voice on the other end was crackling, panicked. "Inbound ETA, 2 minutes. Male, roughly 35, no ID. Massive blunt force trauma, multiple GSWs, gunshot wounds. He was dumped outside a fire station. He's coding." "Copy that," Clara said, her voice steady. "Prepare Trauma 1. She hung up and shouted orders. "Toby, get the crash cart. Dr. Trent, we have a critical inbound. GSWs, unstable." Dr. Nathaniel Trent looked up from his tablet. He was leaning against the counter, scrolling through a real estate app. Trent was the kind of doctor who looked good in a brochure, but vanished when the real work started. He was the nephew of a board member, a fact he mentioned at least twice a shift. "GSW? Probably a gangbanger dumped by his friends," Trent sighed, barely moving. "Stabilize him and ship him to county if he hasn't got insurance, Clara. I'm not spending my night digging bullets out of a drug dealer." "He's a human being, Doctor," Clara snapped, already moving towards the bay doors. "And he's dying." The ambulance bay doors hissed open, letting in a gust of cold rain and the smell of diesel. The paramedics rushed the gurney in, their faces grim. The man on the stretcher was a wreck. He was covered in mud and blood, his clothes shredded. But even under the grime, Clara saw something unusual. He wasn't wearing street clothes. He was wearing tactical pants, the kind you buy at military surplus stores, but higher quality. And his boots, heavy, worn, professional. "He lost a pulse twice on the way," the medic shouted. "We got him back, but he's threading. Get him to Trauma 1, now," Clara commanded. She jumped onto the gurney rail, starting compressions as they ran. Under her hands, the man's chest felt like a cage of broken ribs. She looked at his face. It was swollen, unrecognizable, masked by a thick beard and dried blood. They burst into the trauma room. Clara moved like lightning, hooking up leads, checking lines. "Where is Dr. Trent?" Clara yelled, her eyes glued to the monitor. The heart rate was erratic, ventricular tachycardia. "He's going to arrest again." I'm here," Trent strolled in, snapping on latex gloves with agonizing slowness. "Lower your voice, Nurse Evans." "He needs a chest tube now," Clara said, ignoring his tone. "Breath sounds are absent on the right." "Let me assess before you start diagnosing," Trent sneered. He listened to the chest for a half-second. "Fine. Tension pneumothorax. Set up for a tube." Just as Trent picked up the scalpel, the ER doors swung open again. But this time, it wasn't a medic. It was Administrator Patricia Gower, flanked by 2 security guards and a frantic-looking young man in a silk suit. Patricia Gower was the Director of Operations. She was a woman who viewed patients as spreadsheets, profit in black, loss in red. "Dr. Trent," Patricia's voice was shrill, "stop what you're doing." Trent paused, the scalpel hovering inches from the dying man's chest. "Patricia, I'm in the middle of a procedure." "We have a code VIP," Patricia announced, gesturing to the young man in the silk suit. "This is Ethan Caldwell. His father is the Senator Caldwell, our biggest donor. Ethan has injured his wrist playing tennis at the club, and he is in severe pain. He demands immediate attention." Clara froze. She looked at the dying man on the table, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation at 75%, and then at the spoiled man holding his wrist in the doorway. "You have got to be kidding me," Clara whispered. "Doctor." "Trent," Patricia said, stepping into the sterile field in her heels. "The senator is on the phone. He wants the best attending physician to look at his son. Now." Trent looked at the John Doe on the table, dirty, bloody, likely indigent. Then he looked at Patricia and the promise of political favor. He dropped the scalpel into the tray. "Nurse Evans," Trent said, pulling off his gloves. "Finish stabilizing this one. I'm going to attend to Mr. Caldwell." Clara felt a cold rage ignite in her stomach. "You can't leave. This man has a collapsed lung and internal bleeding. If you leave, he dies." "He's a John Doe, Clara," Trent said dismissively. "Probably a homeless vet or a junkie. Protocol dictates we prioritize triage. Mr. Caldwell is a priority." "A wrist sprain is not a priority over a dying man," Clara screamed, stepping in front of Trent. "This is abandonment. It's malpractice." Patricia Gower stepped forward, her face twisted in a sneer. "It is an administrative order, Nurse Evans. Move aside, or you will regret it." The monitor behind Clara began to blare a flatline tone. The John Doe's heart had stopped. Clara looked at the flatline. She looked at Trent, walking away. She looked at Patricia's smug face. "No," Clara said. "Excuse me?" Patricia blinked. Clara grabbed the scalpel Trent had dropped. "I said no." The silence in Trauma 1 was heavier than the lead aprons in radiology. Even the rhythmic beep of the flatline monitor seemed to hesitate. "What do you think you're doing?" Patricia Gower hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous octave. Clara ignored her. She didn't look at the administrator. She didn't look at the cowardly doctor retreating towards the VIP. Her entire world narrowed down to the man dying on the table. "Toby!" Clara barked. The young nurse jumped. "Take over compressions. Don't stop until I tell you." "But Dr. Trent left," Toby stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't care if the Pope left. Compress." Toby scrambled onto the stool and began pumping the man's chest. Clara grabbed the betadine bottle, splashing it over the man's ribs. She knew she was crossing a line. Nurses did not perform surgical procedures. It was the golden rule. If she cut this man, she was ending her career. But if she didn't, his life ended. It wasn't a choice. "Security!" Patricia shrieked. "Remove her! She's assaulting the patient!" 2 burly guards stepped forward, unsure. They knew Clara. She had baked cookies for their night shifts. They hesitated. "Don't you touch me!" Clara warned, holding the scalpel up, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that made the guards pause. "If you stop me, this man dies, and I will make sure every news station in Seattle knows that Mercy General let a man die for a tennis injury. Do you want that on your conscience?" The guards looked at Patricia, then back at the dying man. They didn't move. Clara turned back to the patient. "Find the intercostal space, 4th rib, mid-axillary line. Her training as a trauma nurse was extensive, and she had watched this procedure 1,000 times. She took a breath. She sliced. Blood hissed out, followed by a rush of air, the tension pneumothorax releasing. The man's chest heaved. "We have a rhythm!" Toby shouted, staring at the monitor. "Sinus tack! He's back!" Clara didn't celebrate. She grabbed a chest tube kit, jamming the plastic tube into the incision she'd just made, securing it with tape. The man's oxygen levels began to climb. 80%, 85%, 90%. She grabbed a stethoscope and listened. Breath sounds. He was breathing. She leaned over him, whispering into his ear, though he was unconscious. "I've got you. You're not dying alone tonight. Not on my watch." She checked his pupils. They were sluggish, but reactive. As she moved his arm to check an IV line, her hand brushed against his neck. Under the grime and the beard, she saw a tattoo just below his ear. It wasn't a gang sign. It was a small black trident with wings. She didn't recognize the symbol, but she filed it away. "Nurse Evans." The voice was cold. Clara straightened up. The patient was stable, critical, but stable. She turned around. Patricia Gower was trembling with rage. Dr. Trent had returned, looking pale and embarrassed, but mostly vindictive. "You performed unauthorized surgery," Trent said, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You are not a surgeon. That is assault and battery." "I saved his life because you were too busy kissing a donor's ring," Clara shot back, stripping off her bloody gloves and throwing them into the bin with a wet slap. "You are finished," Patricia said, her voice eerily calm now. "Get out." "He needs to be transferred to ICU," Clara said, standing her ground. "He has internal injuries that need scans." "We will handle the patient," Trent sneered. "You are no longer an employee of this hospital." "Security," Patricia commanded again. "Escort Miss Evans off the premises immediately. If she resists, call the police." Clara looked at Toby. The young nurse was crying silently. "Watch him, Toby," she said softly. "Don't let them kill him." "I will," Toby whispered. Clara walked towards the door. As she passed Dr. Trent, she stopped. She was 5'5", and he was 6'2", but in that moment she towered over him. "You took an oath, Nathaniel. Do no harm. You broke it tonight. Get out," Trent shouted, his face flushing red. Clara didn't look back. She walked out of the trauma room, through the bustling ER where patients watched her with wide eyes, and out into the cold, rainy night. She sat on the curb of the parking lot, the rain soaking her scrubs instantly. She was shaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow pit of fear. She had just lost her job, her pension, and likely her license. She was 32, single, and broke. But as she looked up at the flickering sign of the emergency room, she thought of the air rushing into that stranger's lungs. She thought of the heartbeat on the monitor. "Worth it," she whispered to the rain. She didn't know that inside the hospital, Toby was wheeling the John Doe towards the elevator, and the man's hand twitched. She didn't know that the man she had saved was not a homeless drifter, and she certainly didn't know that she had just saved the life of Captain Elias Miller, the younger brother of the most dangerous man in the U.S. Special Forces. 3 days passed. For Clara, they were a blur of cheap wine, crying on her couch and ignoring phone calls. The nursing board had already emailed her. An investigation was pending. Mercy General was pushing for full revocation of her license, citing gross negligence and practicing medicine without a license. She was blacklisted. She applied to 3 urgent care clinics. All 3 rejected her within hours. Patricia Gower had been thorough. She hadn't just fired Clara. She had salted the earth. Inside Mercy General, things had returned to a toxic normal. Dr. Trent was strutting around, bragging about how he handled the rogue nurse. The VIP, Ethan Caldwell, had been treated for his sprained wrist with the care usually reserved for royalty and discharged with a prescription for potent painkillers he didn't need. The John Doe, Captain Elias Miller, had been moved to a semi-private room on the 4th floor. He was still in a coma, recovering from the trauma. Because he had no ID on him when he arrived, and Clara had been fired before she could document the tattoo properly, he was listed simply as John Doe, indigent. Patricia Gower had ordered minimum care. Keep him alive, but don't waste resources, she had told the floor nurses. Once he wakes up, we ship him to the state facility. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know that the military beacon embedded in his molar had been damaged in the ambush that nearly killed him, delaying his team's tracking signal. But on the morning of the 4th day, the beacon flickered back to life. It sent a single encrypted ping to a satellite orbiting 200 miles above the Earth. That satellite relayed the coordinates to a secure operations base in Virginia, which then forwarded a code-red alert to a tactical team currently refueling in San Diego. Major Jackson Miller was in the middle of a briefing when his comms unit chirped. He looked at the device. His face, a roadmap of scars and stoicism, went pale for the first time in a decade. "Sir?" his lieutenant asked. "They found him," Jackson said, his voice a low rumble like grinding stones. "They found Elias. He's in Seattle." "Is he alive?" "Signal is weak. He's stationary. A hospital." Jackson stood up, flipping the table over in his haste. "Get the birds ready. We fly now." Back at Mercy General, the morning shift was starting. Patricia Gower was at the front desk of the ER, berating a receptionist for a filing error. The automatic doors slid open. Usually the doors admitted patients, families, or paramedics. This time, 6 men walked in. They didn't walk like civilians. They moved in a phalanx, a V formation. They wore black tactical gear, not police uniforms, but high-end military combat fatigues without insignias. They carried themselves with a lethal grace that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. At the point of the V was Major Jackson Miller. He was 6'4" of pure muscle and intent. He wore dark sunglasses, even indoors, and a beret tucked into his epaulette. His jaw was set in a line so hard it could cut glass. The hospital security guard, a retired cop named Barney, stepped forward. "Excuse me, gentlemen. You can't come in here with—" Jackson didn't even slow down. He simply walked past Barney as if the man were a ghost. One of the men behind Jackson, gently but firmly, moved Barney aside with a hand that felt like a steel bar. The phalanx stopped at the central desk. The entire ER went silent. Doctors stopped dictating. Patients stopped moaning. Everyone stared at the dark giants standing in the middle of the room. Patricia Gower looked up, annoyed. She adjusted her glasses. "Can I help you? This is a hospital, not a parade ground. You are blocking the hallway." Jackson Miller took off his sunglasses. His eyes were ice blue and burned with a terrifying intensity. He placed his hands on the counter. "I am looking for my brother," Jackson said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the back of the room. "Captain Elias Miller. Tracking signal puts him in this building."